Hello and welcome to my show. My name is Bret. This is my channel on YouTube, or you may be watching me on Twitch, um, Periscope. Yeah, that's where I'm at. So I do this live thing every week, and we're coming up on our 100th episode over 2 years of live streams, and it's me talking about DevOps and you asking questions, and sometimes me having guests, and we hang out and you learn something. This week it's just me. I'm going to talk about some news. I got some updates on things that are happening with Docker and Kubernetes and the rest of the community. And we're going to take your questions. So fire them away. The way this works is you ask questions. I'll get to them in order in general. Usually if we're on a topic, I will stick with the questions that are on topic and I'll come back to the questions that aren't. But if you're taking one of my courses, this is where you want to show up. If you have not been to one of these live shows before, or if you're watching this pre-recorded, it's every Thursday, hopefully like clockwork. Sometimes there are technical issues, and hopefully we will have none of those this week. All right, so if you are not a Patreon follower, this show is now sponsored by you, and it has been all year long. We launched my Patreon page early this year. You do not have to pay to get the updates. So think of it as the private feed of everything I'm creating. And you can just click that little follow button there and you can follow all my updates. But if you'd like a little bit more, some exclusive membership benefits, as well as thanking me for all this open source and all this open content that I'm creating, feel free to sign up for one of the membership packages. And I thank you so much to the nearly 100 patrons that have signed up already to offer me a coffee every month. It's basically thanking me for doing this work. And every month we're doing a High Fivers hangout, usually in Zoom lately. Zoom's been the things lately with the pandemic. So everyone's got Zoom. Everyone knows about Zoom. So we've been doing that once a month where we hang out, do some coffee chat, kind of stuff. So feel free to check that out at patreon.com/Bret Fisher. All right. What else? I've got some news. I'm going to run through the news real quick because it's pretty quick. Pretty quick stuff I want to talk about. And then we can get to your questions. So first up, this is actually from last week. And I can't remember. I meant to go back into chat. But someone from last week said that there's Backport coming for WSL2. And I had not heard of it. But like the next day... or actually, no, it was already out. I think someone had seen the blog post before me because that was the August 20th there. So anyway, whoever was in chat, if you're still here today, thank you so much. I was not listening to you. I basically had not heard of this thing, and I was like, I would have known about it. If it's a thing, I would know. As if somehow I have a lock on the internet, and I don't. So that was kind of silly of me, and they were right. This is happening, or has it happened? You let me know in chat. Have you actually updated a non-2004 Windows version? This is basically like the last two releases of Windows 10, the major semi-annual releases, are getting WSL2, which means Docker Desktop with its new functionality, including Home Edition, can now get Docker Desktop with WSL2 support. So I haven't tried this on old releases. I actually do have a older version Windows VM that I could try this on. So I'm curious, have you tried it? What's your experience? I cannot believe that Microsoft's doing this. Like they historically don't go back to older patches and older versions and then retroactively add new features. So this is yet another sort of Microsoft proving that the Windows team is not the same old Windows team we were used to 20 years ago, 10 years ago. They have continued to surprise me with all their deep Docker support, changing the kernel, adding just the fact that WSL2 now works on Windows Home without Hyper-V. They just keep surprising me with doing cool stuff without requiring like all the enterprise features or the latest enterprise upgrades or something like that. So yay for us, because we're the winners in this scenario. Really, what this is about is, for months now, we've been talking since May. So in May, the 2004 or 20.04 or 2004, whatever you want to call it, basically the latest Windows major update for Windows 10, all editions, but the major update offered us this new version of Windows Subsystem for Linux that was better. It had actual kernel in it. It wasn't using kernel emulation. So it means that we can run Docker in the Linux kernel of this Linux VM instead of in a separate Hyper-V VM like Docker's had to create. Well, the problem with that for enterprises is it required you to adopt the brand new 2004 release. And enterprises are typically not on this fast cycle where they do major updates because it's essentially almost like it's like a version upgrade essentially of Windows 10. And so there are plenty of companies that will take years to roll this out, and they might be on a 1909 or a 1903 release, the older versions. So this really, to me, isn't for home people, because if you're on Windows Home at your house, your home machine or whatever, you're a hobbyist, or this is just your work, not your work machine, and you're using home, this is not really for you, because you should go get the 2004 release. It's got more things. There's no reason to wait. And if you just look up, if you haven't got it yet, the first thing you do is you just type WinVer, WINVER. That'll give you the version number so you can see whether or not you're on 2004. And if you don't see that in Windows Update, because if you go in and manually do a Windows Update and you don't see it still, you can just look for WSL or WSL Windows Update Force, I think is how I Googled it. And like the first or second articles will give you a link to the Microsoft page that will let you force the download of the patch. But if you're on an enterprise release and you're only doing 1903 or 1909 and the minor updates that come with those, this is for you, because this means you don't have to convince your company to give you the latest 2004 to get the WSL2 support. Yay! So, super cool. What I don't know is if these patches have already been released. I saw rumors that they were already released, so let me know in chat what you're seeing. Jay, I think your question, I'm not sure, when will SWSL not be a side-loaded install? So, I mean, WSL2 eventually will change over time. They wanted to be cautious with WSL2 over WSL1 in terms of it being built out of the box. And they also, like, for example, the kernel updates a separate download. Supposedly over time, Microsoft's going to make this easier to use in Windows, but for right now, since WSL2 is basically a full Linux install inside of your Windows machine, they wanted to be cautious about having it as like built in out of the box or like just a checkbox install. They wanted to. This is all about them moving rapidly, being able to update quickly without having to have major window update delays. So I hear that a lot of this stuff is going to get easier over time. I don't honestly think WSL2 will ever be out of the box with Windows, just because most people that aren't in tech don't need it, and most people in tech don't even need it. It's really just sysadmins and developers that want to either play with something like Docker or play with something like Linux, or use because you can already do things like have a bash shell or whatever without Linux on your Windows machine. And so many people are, PowerShell people and are not Docker people. So I think this is still a very small fraction of the world's Windows users that it would ever like be a default install. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but if not, give me more details there. And on your comment on Home Edition, on Windows 10 Home, we historically WSL1 could not run Docker inside it without a lot of hacking, and basically you were breaking Docker Desktop to do it. And it never really ran in the Linux VM because WSL1 was not a full Linux kernel, which Docker needs. In fact, if you look back at the betas of WSL2, even the early parts of WSL2 didn't work with Docker. It didn't work with Kubernetes. Like, there was a lot of kernel things that happened because really Docker and Kubernetes are tools that are just manipulating the kernel, right? So the Linux kernel had to be adjusted in this new WSL2 world to support all this stuff, the C groups, the namespaces, that sort of thing. So the problem, though, with Home was that traditionally Docker Desktop relied on a full Hyper-V VM to work and to give you all that nice Docker Desktop functionality. Hyper-V is not and still is not in Home Edition. So Home users were always left out. But starting in May, Home users were able to get this 2004 release, which offered WSL2 support, which is technically a full Linux VM, but without Hyper-V. It uses a separate component of Windows that you can now see in the component install. I believe it's what it uses. It's called like virtualization components or virtualization services or something. It's not called Hyper-V. It's not branded Hyper-V. So that means home users can now use Docker Desktop, but you have to get the WSL2 support to do that. The quickest way to do that on Home Edition is just to get the 2004 release. But am I bringing on any guests for the 100th week? I mean, that 100th show, that would be fun. Have some of the people that have been around multiple times on multiple shows on the 100th. Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll think about doing that. Yeah, we're on like 90. This is 93, show 93. So I got 7 weeks to figure that out. That'll be fun. Saeem saying it's working perfectly on 1904. WSL looks awesome. All right, great. 1904. I think you mean 1903. But yeah, okay. So WSL2 is working awesome. I assume you're talking about WSL2 on 1903. So, all right, next up on the list. Yeah, so this was the blog post, and I don't know if they gave dates. Currently, the backport of 1903 and 1909 will only be for x64, which is most of us. If you're using ARM, you're going to have to upgrade to 2004. To get this backport, you just need to check for updates. So if you're on an old enterprise release or an old pro release, you can go check for updates today, and you should be able to get this. So hopefully within the next month, like everyone should, like basically the bell has been rung for Docker Toolbox, the legacy thing that we needed, especially in Windows 10 Home, for a lot of these edge cases. Granted, if you're still on Windows 8, which I do have a few students that are running like older computers on Windows 8, those computers can all update to Windows 10 for free, as far as I know. So I still wonder why they're on Windows 8. But every once in a while, I get a question about Windows 8 or Windows 7. And technically, Windows 8 is still under, I think, some sort of enterprise support lifecycle thing. So it's just the problem is that Microsoft didn't put the functionality in that Docker needs to run a Docker desktop experience. So in those cases, I think I'm going to completely, in all of my courses, I'm going to completely get rid of all the Docker Toolbox stuff. And I'm going to move to multipass, which I've talked about before. So multipass.run. And if you haven't tried this, it's basically it's the fastest way I know of to run a Linux Ubuntu VM locally on your Windows machine or Mac machine or on Linux. I mean, running a Linux VM in Linux. It's a one-line command. It allows you to create many of them, and then you can install Docker. You can install Kubernetes with Minikube. Sorry, not Minikube, Micro K8s or K3s, right? If you want to do that. It's the fastest way to do that. So Docker Toolbox used to be the way I would recommend people create multiple swarm nodes, but this is fine. Like this is supported where Docker Toolbox hasn't been patched in at least a year. I know certain people have issues with Docker Toolbox, so I'm looking forward to us leaving that legacy solution behind and either doing Docker Desktop or multipass. So if you're in my courses, those updates will be coming to the courses. All right. I also next thing. Let me just make sure there's no comments on that. Next up is I wanted to reference. By the way, I'm not putting in links, so I'm going to put in my Patreon into chat in case you want to check that out. By the way, that Patreon is the best way to not miss anything, like any of my updates on any of my open source and stuff. All right, so this is the backport announcement. And then this next link is something I thought was really useful and something I wish that I did more in my courses of, because I don't have the details of what this post is yet. But in Kubernetes, tracking inbound connections, just like in Docker, can be challenging even when you understand how it all works, because there's sometimes multiple layers of NAT. So your source NAT IP address is changed out multiple times, and it's really hard to maybe track connections. If you want to log IP addresses for clients coming in, if you need to do things based on where they're coming from, based on their IP range, these are all challenges that containers can add because there's usually some sort of network proxying going on that requires translation. So this post I thought was really good at walking you through some tutorials steps in Kubernetes on how to set this up and how to basically see what's going on, how to understand. It has some graphics to give you a nice view. I just went to see that image. A nice little image there that's showing how connections are coming in through the client, through the node, and then the node nats to the other node, based on the service and the pod, because the service is typically going to NAT with a virtual IP address. So if you don't fully understand how these connections are coming into your clusters, this is actually very similar to how Swarm does it with overlay networking. But obviously this post is specific to Kubernetes. Anyway, it's part of the Kubernetes continual improvement in their documentation under their tutorials, and I thought it was really good. A good walkthrough. It gives you some commands. You can actually walk through this example and show different ways to set up your services based on your requirements for different control of your IP addresses or different abilities with your IP addresses based on, whether do you have a load balancer? Do you need to use node ports? Stuff like that, right? All right. Next up on the news list, I just saw this today when I jumped on my computer. Alex Ellis, who's been on this show before this year. We talked about serverless and a lot of his other projects like inlets. He has a course on serverless up on the Linux Foundation's course platform, I guess you could call it. So the Linux Foundation is offering his course, and I'm going to put his tweet up here so you can all check it out. He's basically, I think, one of the experts out there on serverless because he built a serverless platform and he runs a community running an open platform for serverless or functions as a service, whatever you want to call it. And before that, he was, using Lambdas and experimenting with other things. In fact, he was inspired to do this stuff in containers because back in the day, 3+ years ago, he felt that, the platforms like Lambda were lacking a lot of the features that he wanted. So he's got a course up here. I think it's a free course, but if you'd like a certificate of completion, you can pay a couple $100 for that if you needed that for work or something. You could do that, but it's a free course through the Linux Foundation. So congrats, Alex. That's pretty cool. Yeah. So if I was going to go do some serverless training, I'd immediately go do that course. And this is really the last thing I wanted to talk about before we get to questions. This is hilarious. So this is from a show, in case if it's not popular in your part of the world. Always Sunny in Philadelphia has been a show that's been really popular in America for many years now. It's a comedy show, and this meme has had other things put in the background, but the fact that it's the CNCF landscape in the background is perfect. It is choice. So that's the tweet of the week right there. I think that's pretty much sums up most people's experience with trying to figure out what products they should use, how they should plug all these products together. In fact, I think that you could create a full-time consulting business out of being a little bit aware of some, not even all these things, because obviously no one could be knowledgeable about all these things, but just being good at some of these things, like one or two in each bracket, and then just guiding people down this roadmap of mess is, I think there's a full-time consulting gig there in case anybody's looking for a job. Because a lot of my clients, when they're coming into containers, they're just like, I don't know what to do with this. Like this gives me a big list, but I don't understand what part goes where and which parts I can not do. Like, can I leave some of these parts out and not do some of the others and all that stuff? So I thought that was pretty funny. So you're welcome. You're welcome, Internet. That is the tweet of the week. I've never had a tweet of the week before, but maybe I should start doing that. All right, let me scroll back up here in the questions. Let's see. Let's see what we got here. I think the very first question, actually, before I went live from Jay, was where is the best training for learning to do Docker dev software coding with WSL and Windows systems? So that started off the conversation just talking about WSL. And there are a couple of things you might want to look at. Someone who's, I think, more generically just good on Windows videos and who's been doing a lot more videos is Scott Hanselman. So if you don't know about Scott Hanselman, I've been a fan of his for over a decade, and I was lucky enough to have him on this live show for DockerCon. He showed up for an hour and took over the show, and that was a lot of fun. But go check out his channel. He has been putting up good videos, like high-quality videos, and he's a busy guy. Like, he works at Microsoft. He's a bigwig. He's got constant commitments, and has been working at Microsoft for almost a decade, over a decade at this point. I met him before he worked at Microsoft, but he's always been a great guy to listen to, always been a great speaker, always has fun talks. And so I love his series on computer stuff they didn't teach you, because the idea behind that, by the way, is it's things that tend to be stuff that just works, like why do we have terminal emulators and why do we need to emulate and how does that all work? You know, things that sort of, if you are new into computers, unlike, you know, us graybeards, you don't have 30 years of experience that taught you how TCP/IP works, because you had to learn it when it was brand new to the world, and you had to implement it at a company because none of your devices even talked over TCP/IP, and you had to, you know, we didn't even know what a DHCP server was because no one had ever made one, because that was strictly for IPs. So a lot of us that have that experience, we have this old person knowledge that when you come into the world of this stuff, it's all just working. And so it's a great idea, and he does it well. Anyway, so if you start looking for some of his stuff, he has some WSL videos that I think are pretty good on setting it up, and you can find those. I actually have a playlist, I think. Pretty sure in my playlist on my channel. I have let's see, I have a Windows Docker development. That might be it. Basically, go look at a couple of my playlists here. I have a playlist on Windows Docker development, and I have a playlist on Windows 10 Ultimate Shell. I think both of those are really valuable. Both of them probably have Scott Hanselman videos in them. So I'll put those in there. But yeah, it's good stuff. All right. Thanks for that great question. As an application architect, I have learned easy is based on familiarity. Linux, not all my team knows Linux, the devs on Windows. I completely agree. I work with teams that are pure Windows. I work with teams that are pure .NET, pure C#, right? Don't have a Linux server to speak of anywhere in their environment. And so I think, honestly, that is maybe not the majority of people, but there's a huge chunk of developers and IT workers that are not Linux savvy. And that's okay, right? Linux has grown in popularity over the last 20 years. So to some of us who especially are focused on the cloud and on distributed computing and not so much corporate enterprise computing, I think we all just assume that people should know Linux at this point. But I meet people all the time that this is normal. Windows is normal. So there are conferences where my Mac is an unusual thing. Not very long ago, I was the Windows guy going to Windows conferences with a Mac, and actually running Windows. The dual booting scenario, whatever, on Mac. Running Windows on my Mac exclusively, not running the Mac OS. Right, that was me a decade ago. So I think that's normal, and there's nothing wrong with that. So Docker Desktop has a Windows container mode that I'm working on, actually trying to get support from the community to make it better. and if you've seen me on this show talk about it, Docker has a roadmap, right? So I put in some wish lists. Let me see. Bret Fisher. Yeah, so they haven't investigated yet. I don't think. These are not even. Oh, maybe I need to no space. There we go. So I'm going to plug these in there. Check out these issues because several of them are focused on trying to get better Windows container support out of the box with Docker Desktop. So what if you're a developer that really only wants to concern yourself with Windows containers, not Linux containers, and you just you don't even need Hyper-V, you don't want a VM for Linux containers, you don't want WSL2, you don't need it, you love PowerShell. The new Windows terminal is great. It doesn't need to have a bash shell if you're comfortable in PowerShell. You could do that, right? And there are plenty of people that want to do that. And so my goal is Docker Desktop can be installed without ever needing WSL2, without ever needing Hyper-V. You can just opt for a checkbox that says Windows containers only. And if you do that, there's a thing in Windows containers known as Hyper-V isolation or process isolation. Now, process isolation in Windows containers is much like we're used to with Linux containers, which is each container doesn't need its own VM. It's just running on the same host processor kernel, right? It's running on that same kernel as the host OS, like it does in Linux, and that's known as isolation mode for Windows containers. Weirdly, in Windows containers, that's not the default. It defaults to Hyper-V isolation, and I think that's maybe due to historical reasons. When Docker Desktop first came out, there was no processor isolation, or process isolation, I should say, sorry. There was no process isolation on Windows 10. It was only for Windows Server. And over time, Microsoft made Windows 10 support process isolation with containers, which was really cool because I think that for most people, process isolation is enough. If you're in a private enterprise, process isolation works for Linux containers. You don't need one Linux VM for every container usually. So why not use that for Windows containers? So I want to advocate for this. And so if you're someone in that world, if you are interested in this, just being able to run Docker Desktop, and really, you don't even need Docker Desktop really, unless you just want the GUI. In theory, all you really need is Docker D, the daemon, dockerd.exe as a service, and then Docker CLI as the client. So it's docker.exe is your client, dockerd.exe is your service. That's all you need to run Docker in Windows Container Process Isolation. You don't need any virtualization. You don't need any, everything is handled in the Docker daemon. So there's actually, if you're curious about this, there's actually a way to do it today without ever having Docker Desktop. And it's from this blog. I don't know this individual, but thank you so much for the Power User blog. It's a great name for a blog. And Chris here has a great walkthrough on how to just download 2 binaries of Docker and get them working on Windows 10. And I think he did it on Windows 10 and just do it without Hyper-V. You don't, maybe you're in VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure, and you don't have the ability to do nested virtualization where you create a Hyper-V VM inside of your virtual desktop VM, right? Maybe you don't have that. Maybe you're running on a cloud somewhere, or you're already running a virtual machine inside your Mac, or maybe you got a Linux machine running Windows VMs in it or something like that. Well, this is your deal. This is what you want if you are interested in Windows containers. So that's a pretty cool thing. All right. So my point there is, if you care about this stuff, upvote the roadmap issues. More upvotes on things mean Docker is going to pay more attention. This is why they put the roadmap here, is because they're using the upvotes as a way to gauge interest in specific new features for Docker Desktop. And I'd love for them to just simply test this because it technically already works. I think one of the engineers just got it working without much change to the code, and they just need to add these features to the installer, basically. Hello, test, welcome back. Hello, Maz, welcome back. Jay says, I upgraded to 2004 because this wasn't out, but planned to try on other team machines. Cool. yeah, come back and let us know in another week in the live chat or in the Slack chat. So if you didn't know, you can go to chat.bretfisher.com. This is where my course community and a lot of us hang out. And this is on Slack. However, I have previously, in the last couple of weeks, I've been talking about on Twitter that we're going to be moving to a Discord server. And not necessarily moving, I'm going to keep both open because there's 30,000 people. This is actually an old number here. There's 31,000 people in the Docker Mastery chat here. But I wanted to make it larger than that, a larger chat community. So I'm working on a Discord server, which if you haven't checked out Discord, it's a fantastic community. It used to be gamer focused, but now this year, Discord is changing to be just a community focused chat tool. And it's one of the best places, I think, for creating a decentralized chat community. And they do voice, video, screen sharing. It does it all. And it's got its roots in gaming, but there's, if you look at this front page of their website now, other than the logo being a controller, it is almost not even mentioning gaming anymore. It's all talking about hanging out, study groups, that kind of thing. And they have great apps. I think their apps are actually better than Slack. So go check out Discord if you're interested in being a part of the first wave of people getting into my Discord server. If you're in Slack, if you love Slack, just hang out in Slack. Like Slack's going to stay there. But there's a lot of cool things we can do in Discord. We can do voice and video chat. We can screen share in Discord. There are no limits in Discord, so it won't delete our old messages after 10,000 messages. There's a lot of cool things there, including IRC-like moderation. So I can give you access to specific channels for specific courses, stuff like that. So let me know in chat or in the comments or a thumbs up or something like that if you are interested in that stuff, because it's coming. We're working on it almost daily now, making sure that all the permissions are set up. All of this stuff's going to be pretty cool for when it launches. So the hope there is that we're making a DevOps community that's learning together and helping each other, learn and implement DevOps and things like GitOps and containers and all that stuff. So, all right. I don't even know why I started talking about that. But the point was if you wanted to go hang out and Slack, there's already a Slack community there at chat.bretfisher.com. And again, 31,000 people have accounts there in our community, and coming soon, Discord. Yeah, Moz, I see Docker's putting a lot of effort to support Windows. So Microsoft and Docker, so think about this. Microsoft has never competed with Docker. We don't know what sort of formal partnership agreement they have, but they have always been heavy into Microsoft. And, for example, Docker worked first on Windows before, any other non-Linux OS, really, I think, back in the day. Like Docker Desktop, when it first shipped in 2016, was for Windows, right? It shipped for Windows and Mac, but they had specific extra functionality in Windows just for Windows people. Microsoft has not created their own Docker, right? They didn't compete with Docker, create their own container runtime that was, competing with Docker. There's clearly a partnership there, and Microsoft has continually updated their own kernels and even offered support for Docker with Microsoft support agreements for a third-party tool, which is crazy. Like I don't know that they've ever done that before. I can't remember the last time they ever did that, where you could buy a Windows Server license and you get Docker support out of the box from Microsoft. So, Microsoft definitely supports Docker. And Docker definitely puts in a lot of Windows features. They put a lot of focus into that. They have a whole team in France, I think in Paris actually, that focuses on the Docker desktop Windows experience. I'm using Docker Compose for development on Windows 2004, WSL 2. After 20 plus Docker Compose builds during a day, vmem process consumes all free memory. Seems like a memory leak bug. Any solution? Anton, that's a good question. I am not aware of one, but what you can do is you need to file a bug report if you haven't already, or if you haven't found other people. So in GitHub, under Docker, if you look for win, I think it's for win, yeah, /issues, you want to put an issue there. All right, you want to give as much detail as possible. In fact, you can actually send them a debug report and link it in your issues, right? And so that's for specific Windows Docker desktop issues. And if you're having this kind of bug, check out the Edge release. So go looking for Docker Desktop Edge, and you can toggle back and forth between, you can install Edge over top of stable and then stable over top of Edge. But go check out the Edge release, right? And they are constantly updating the Edge release. Like I'm on the Edge and I get like an update every week, it seems like, or every 2 weeks. So they're fixing lots of bugs there that eventually make it into stable. Go check that out if that helps, Anton. Hopefully that'll work. But yeah, definitely using up all free memory. One of the things you might want to do is, in WSL2. So I seem to remember there's been some comments about WSL2. So memory in WSL2 is a thing, and that may not be Docker's fault, right? Like, because if Docker's just running inside of WSL2 and WSL2 is taking up all the memory, I seem to remember some people grumbling about that since WSL2 release. And there's definitely, I think, some work to be done on issues like, automatically giving back memory when it's no longer being needed, performance, edge cases in WSL2. I think the Windows team definitely has some work to do on that to perfect the WSL2 experience, which is why, when they released it, it wasn't installed by default. You had to separately move your WSL1 to WSL2, all those things. That's because I think they wanted to roll this out slowly because they knew that it wasn't going to be perfect for everyone day one. What can you tell me about the Docker Compose host name and domain name flags? What are they useful for? I don't know. I mean, are you talking specifically about Docker Compose run? Which command are you referencing in the Docker Compose? Like Docker, let's see, compose, run, help. So I only see that. Skip host name or host? Is that what you're talking about? Host, I don't know about domain name. I'm not sure what command you're referring to. Peloton, help me out. Give me some info. What are you looking for? Yeah, I don't see those options. I mean, the -- host is all about which engine you want to connect to. If you want to connect to a remote engine with Docker Compose or the one on your local machine, it defaults to your local machine. Yeah, let me know what's going on there. Let's see. Question about Docker security. How to edit AppArmor default profile in Docker. Where is this file located? I wouldn't edit the default one. I would simply apply your own at runtime. So the AppArmor documentation is in test is in docs, right? So if I just search the docs for AppArmor, you'll see how to do that. So it probably would answer all these questions in the Docker docs. It shows you the default profile there, but oh, that's the old profile location. Sorry. But the Docker default is good. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong window. So the Docker default is implied by default. It's always applied when you use Docker command line. And I don't believe that's true, by the way. If you use Kubernetes, you have to specifically add these things. I'm not even sure if AppArmor even works in Kubernetes. I've not actually looked up AppArmor in Kubernetes yet. But in Docker, it's enabled by default, and they have their own default profile. If you want to customize your own, then walk through this tutorial. I believe it'll tell you. Let's see, Melissa, Azure DevOps or just DevOps? I'm not sure what that means. I mean, Azure DevOps is a product. DevOps is an ideology or a methodology. So I'm not sure that Azure DevOps to me is a product that can implement tooling to get you to your DevOps goals. While I don't believe there really is ever a DevOps tool, there are tools that will help you implement DevOps workflows or DevOps metrics that can help you get your metrics. But DevOps is mostly about process and business objectives and metrics around, downtime, recover from failure, stuff like that, right? So, people that are implementing DevOps are usually focused on automation and monitoring key metrics like the time it takes to deploy, the time it takes to recover, stuff like that. So yes, Azure DevOps is a thing that I hear people like. I do not use it, but I definitely hear people talking about it. So, Docker VMware driver. I don't know that would be a thing. So I'm not sure if you're talking about how do you do Docker in VMware. So yeah, I'm not sure what that question really means. There is not a driver for Docker. Maybe you're talking about Docker Machine, which uses a virtualization platform to create VMs. That would be a thing with VMware, yes. And you could just search Docker VMware, Docker Machine. But Docker Machine's an old tool, so I don't really recommend that anymore anyway. So, but technically you can use Docker Machine with VMware tooling. So yeah. All right. Before I wrap this show up, I was hoping to finish some things on my Compose example. So I'm wearing my traffic shirt today. And I wanted to give an update on, let's see, GitHub, Compose. On this thing. So we've talked about this several times in the last couple of weeks over the last month. In fact, I committed it 28 days ago. So it's an example about how to develop locally with TLS certs and have a proxy so that you can have multiple websites or web endpoints like APIs and whatnot, all under one URL using a friendly URL, something like I use, which is Bret LOL. I bought a domain and I set it up so that I could use it locally on my machine. And you're welcome to use that. But there's a walkthrough here, and one of the community members, I basically need to implement some new things. Someone figured out that you could really use Let's Encrypt with a localhost if you use DNS validation, which is fantastic, because then you don't have to create your own trusted certificates, and it seems legitimate and seems still secure. I don't see how this method would be risky or insecure in any way, so I'm going to update this with that, as well as some more information and maybe some YouTube videos or something on this in the coming weeks. But if you're interested in following that, if you have local development needs if you wished all of your development websites locally were all under the similar URLs, for example, if you wished that every time you spun up a web container that it was always at, yourdomain.com or something that you owned, or just one of the ones that I given here as examples for free, like xip.io or vcap.me or bret.lol. If you just wanted to use one of those domains for all your development needs locally and have built-in TLS certificates and use a single endpoint port proxy, so it's always running on port 443 and 80, like that's what this is about. Because you could have all your Compose files all set up to use this, and then you just basically spin down projects, spin up projects, and all this stuff lights up inside of the proxy. So I still would love anyone's issues on this. I think I've put in we had one issue here actually that I haven't responded to actually. But I'd love for you to throw in ideas for new features on this, or give it a star if you like the idea and you want to see more work on it. Yeah. So I'm going to do some more with this. I just didn't get. I was almost going to get it done this morning, and then I ran out of time before the show. So that's still coming. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up in case you have any more questions. So remember to support this show on Patreon, and you don't have to pay. If you want to just follow, you can go down here and click follow at the bottom, and you can, you can help me out there with a coffee a month if you'd like, or just follow for all of the open source updates, all of my course updates, stuff like that. And let's see. Actually, it looks like I've gotten some chat. Looks like my chat's broken. People are talking in chat, but I'm not seeing it. Sorry, everyone. Just realized. Looks like chat broke like a while ago. Jeez. All right, I'm catching up on chat. Looks like we had some busted chat today. Saeem says, want to see Liz Rice on the 100th show. Yeah, that's stretch goals. I had her on the show at the beginning of the year. Someone has a Stream Deck. Yes, I do. I do have a Stream Deck. Can I run 2 different container engines on Linux and Windows? Well, I'm not sure what you mean. Maybe. For example, I can run Docker and container D separately. You can run, for example, I can run Docker and micro K8s on the same Linux host. So that's 2 container engines, and they're not sharing containers. Man, do not know what's going on with my chat. I think it's Restream. I think my Restream chat broke. Oh, yeah. Looks like connection error. Yeah, so sorry about that, everyone. I just thought people were quiet in chat today. All right, I'm going to bring this chat out so we can. All right, let's get to the questions that you had. Nope, that won't work. Let's do this one. Yeah. All right. Sweet. What do we got here? We have been trained by the FOSS community to hate Windows. It is not that bad, just a bit difficult to learn things on. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I'm on Mac. I mean, I'm a huge FOSS fan, right? But I'm on Mac because I'll just be honest. It's a really great ecosystem. Like a lot of great paid apps, a lot of tie-ins with the iPad, iPhone, Apple Watch. I mean, I'm kind of an all Apple person, but I've got, a Windows server in the closet running a bunch of Linux VMs on a Windows 2020 server 2019. I've got a Raspberry Pi upstairs. I've got all the things. But I think for getting my work done, I am on the Apple ecosystem for just getting work done. When I want to tinker, I do other things. But when I want to just be productive, I tend to gravitate to Mac nowadays. Let's see. All right. I'm actually following your course. Docker Mastery so far is very helpful. I just wanted to know for DevOps, do I need to learn Bash or Python or something else like Ansible or Jenkins? All right. So for DevOps stuff, there I have a DevOps. See, Bret.show DevOps. I have a list. So for those of you that are new to DevOps or new to my courses, there's basically you need to learn one thing at a time, right? Because there's too much to learn in DevOps. We can't all know it. I don't know everything about Ansible, Jenkins, Bash, and Python, right? I'm certainly not a good Python developer. So the challenge there is to learn one thing at a time and only learn one thing in an area. So, for example, if you are new to DevOps, if you're new to cloud, learn one cloud, learn one scripting or programming language, whichever one. It could be Bash, it could be Python, it could be Golang, it could be Node.js, JavaScript, right? But just do one. Don't try to accomplish all this all at the same time, and then learn one automation tool. So, I wouldn't learn Ansible at this point. Not that it's not useful, but if you're starting fresh, Terraform is probably easier to learn and will get you farther in terms of the true world of DevOps. Ansible is still a little bit more of the traditional model of running SSH commands on servers, whereas Terraform is very much about infrastructure as code, even though you could argue that they're both infrastructure as code. I think that Terraform is a sort of much more modern GitOps approach to infrastructure. So I prefer Terraform over Ansible. There are some things you can do in Ansible that you can't do in Terraform, but I think that really, if I had to pick tools that you could learn, like if you were starting fresh, it'd be learn Docker, learn AWS, learn some Bash basics, but don't necessarily become a Bash expert. You need to know how to read it. Mostly, you don't necessarily have to be able to write it all from scratch natively, and then go learn Terraform. Especially go learn Git. If you don't know Git, the Git versioning system, the CVS system. You can get a lot of great Git tutorials. So everything we do nowadays is in Git, and you should definitely know more than just like Git commit and Git pull, right? So I would do those all first, and that's a lot. Like that'll take you a while, and then later worry about things like learning another cloud, or learning another language, or learning Ansible versus Terraform, or learning Jenkins, because Jenkins is complex. So I try to get people productive, because if you can learn one cloud, one basic scripting language, it's just at least enough to understand and read it and know what it's doing. Learn some Linux basics so that you understand what Linux is doing in the background. Learn a little bit of Terraform so you at least can create some things from YAML, and then learn some container stuff with just Docker. You can get pretty far, right? Like you can do a lot on the internet with just that knowledge. If you learn how EC2 works, how RDS works in AWS, some of those basic infrastructure concepts, security groups, networking, you can get pretty far. You can make infrastructure and you can make it automated. And then you can go worry about a CI tool later, right? Like you can pick up an easy tool. Jenkins is not necessarily easy. So maybe pick a SaaS product first. Ideally, just pick the one that your organization already uses and learn it. Jenkins is a complex enterprise tool that not everybody needs nowadays. So there's lots of tools in the market that are trying to take away Jenkins' throne. Jenkins is definitely like the 800-pound gorilla of having all the features for everyone to use. So, but I don't necessarily advocate you learn it right out of the gate. If you're trying to get a job being a Jenkins expert, then go learn Jenkins. If you're trying to be a more well-rounded DevOps person, you will want to eventually learn a little bit about Jenkins, but it's not necessarily the first thing I would tell you to go use. Maybe go use Circle CI or Travis or any one of these, or GitHub Actions, which is becoming more and more popular. Just learn a lot of the tooling on GitHub, and you'll be quite useful to in a job or in a team. And if you learn one of these different tools in each part of the space, then you're able to be useful across the spectrum of DevOps stuff. Go learn one basic monitoring tool, right? And learn how to understand metrics about monitoring hardware and then application performance. And just kind of get into that. And that's a lot. Like that's probably 6 months of solid learning. And you'll still be useful to a team that doesn't use all those same tools, because you've used a tool like them. You'll understand and you'll be able to adapt quicker to those other tools that you haven't tried. Hope that helps. If I patch a service to move from V1 to V2 in a deployment, can there be delay in traffic going to V2 even though service is updated due to some IP table config? I don't believe so. I mean, I'm not sure if you're talking about Kubernetes, Docker, or Swarm, or what you're talking about. But you say deployment, so maybe I'm thinking Kubernetes. A packet. So first off, a connection doesn't really get pushed somewhere else. So if you think about it, a connection. We're talking about TCP right now. A TCP connection is established to a node, and during a rolling update of something, existing connections at some point will either be terminated or they will do a connection reattempt, and that reattempt is sent to the new place, the new version. Ideally, you never want to terminate connections because that's like killing a connection. It's not so. If it's a static website, that's not really important. You can kill connections, but if you're providing, file uploading or some sort of WebSocket kind of thing, you need to care about connection retries and sort of doing a termination of the connection in a graceful way. And that's really more about your app, not so much about Kubernetes. But so there is, I wouldn't say that like IP table configs would somehow delay packet routing, because the packets don't get routed to the new place until IP config is done, right? It needs first IP config gets updated, then the virtual IP address on your service will decide where it's going to route that new connection. It's not so much packet routing, it's more connection routing. Think about it that way. Have I seen Portainer's Kubernetes version? Any thoughts about the tool? I have heard of it. I have not used it yet, so I don't have any thoughts. Portainer's been a great tool for Docker and Swarm, so hopefully it's a great tool if you need to use Docker, Swarm, and Kubernetes. But I have not tried it. Yes, updates to IPVS, IP tables. So are you saying that there is no 100% safe blue-green deployment, even though service points to V2, K8s can still send traffic to V1 for a brief amount of time? I would say that on this question around blue-green deployments and traffic, there is no guarantee. So correct, I wouldn't say, again, we're talking about connections, not packets. So connections are going to go to like a typical rolling update, whether it's blue-green, because blue-green, the idea is that all connections are moved over at once. But the reality is in a blue-green typically is that you don't want to sever connections that are in transit, right? So if you've got packets happening on a connection, you don't want those cut off. And to my knowledge, a blue-green is not able to suddenly move that connection from one host to another. It is more of establishing a new connection, a new TCP connection that will then send its packets to that new place, right? So that new place might be on the same host, a different host. So when we start talking about at the TCP level, you're not just dealing with raw packets, you're really dealing with a TCP connection that has to first be established, and the client has to establish that. So from what I've seen, and granted there may be some new networking stuff that I just don't know about, but from what I've seen on that, regardless of the speed at which you're moving connections over, it's not really moving ever. It is, you have connections here that are persistent, they're TCP connections, and they need to end at some point, and how they end is up to your application and a little bit up to it's both your application's job and the Kubernetes or whatever your orchestrator or your load balancer or whatever you've got in between the connection endpoints. And it's up to those to decide, is it going to be severed? In other words, not gracefully terminated, or are you going to do basically a TCP closing of the session? If you're talking about HTTP, sometimes that might be long polling. But if you get into that stuff, you'll understand the packet, the termination of the sockets of the TCP connection sockets, and how that is going to happen. Now that's nothing new to Kubernetes. That's standard TCP stuff. So when you get down to that really low level, there's a lot of nuance in exactly how those things happen. But a blue-green deployment doesn't mean that that 1 second not a single packet is going here and suddenly it goes to the others. Because if you do that and you're doing TCP, and what that probably means is you just severed all those connections. And what if people were uploading files? What if people were downloading files? Right? If they're in the middle of a binary transfer or a HTTP transfer of a file, right? Like you don't want to sever that. Ideally, you want a graceful shutdown there. So there's always going to be a window in my mind, regardless of whether it's blue, green, canary, rolling update. At least that's my take on it. Someone else that's smarter than me might have a different approach to it, but. I saw something recently about storing Kubernetes. I saw something recently about storing a Kubernetes manifest as a base64 encoded string as a container label, and then possibly using that to deploy to Kubernetes. I'm not, Cole, I'm not sure why I would do that. I mean, I can't think of a reason. I've never seen anyone needing to do that. I've not needed to do it, so it's hard for me to understand why I would want to do that. I'm a fan of GitOps, so I like to put all of my manifest in Git, use version control as my methodology for tracking change. Again, with the DevOps goals, we want to have change logging. We want to track every change to the system. We want to be able to control and ideally revert back on that change control. So I like Git. If I put it in a Kubernetes manifest, then I have to depend on Kubernetes controlling the change. And historically, Kubernetes history and diffs haven't been that great. So you're now depending on the Kubernetes etcd database for that. I'm sure some people have legitimate reasons for doing it, but I would say in almost all cases, you need to have a very specific reason to do that. That's just my gut, but I've not read that, so I'm not super savvy on that. Yes. I could always be older, but I could always be younger. I could be both. What cloud provider or providers can you recommend for Docker Swarm? Any of them. Swarm, Docker Swarm is just the Docker binary on any VM. So whatever one floats your boat. If you like easy stuff, Linode or DigitalOcean are easy. If you have requirements to run on Azure or AWS, then you got to use those. But Swarm will run on any of those, and it doesn't care, right? It's just a binary running on host that talks over TCP and UDP ports to other hosts. So it functions the same way regardless. To my knowledge, there's no major providers that provide a Swarm automation out of the box, so they're not going to, give you any advantages one way or the other. But if you're just on pet projects or you're a really small company and you don't need complicated infrastructure, then just do DigitalOcean. I'd say do that. Yeah, DigitalOcean's really popular. Linode's really popular. Both of those would allow you to go from Swarm to Kubernetes and implement Kubernetes using their self-hosted Kubernetes solutions. So you could if you grow out of Swarm, if you ever need the features of Kubernetes and you want to leave Swarm, you don't have to leave the cloud provider with those anymore. Now pretty much everybody has a Kubernetes offering, so except for maybe Packet. Can we schedule tasks which are executing PowerShell scripts with a Docker container? I don't see why not. I mean, a container is just another binary. So how you do that is really the question. It's not a question of if, it's just how you would do that. If you're looking for an orchestrator to do that for you, or are you looking for Windows Task Manager? Traditionally, the cron of Windows is the scheduled tasks in Windows. So you could probably just run a Docker command with a scheduled task, or I'm pretty sure that there's a PowerShell module that will talk to Windows scheduled task even on a server, and then you could just set up to run a Docker container, and then it will exit, right? Out of the box, Kubernetes has cron support, cron and cron jobs, and Swarm has it in the mainline branch. So if you were actually to build from source today, you could get cron support inside Docker Swarm with Swarm jobs, but we don't yet have a major release of Docker that we're waiting on to support that in, whatever the 2020 release of Docker Engine. We don't have that yet, but we'll have that hopefully this year. Does DigitalOcean have integration with Swarm like Kubernetes? No cloud integrates with Swarm, nor does it need to, because Swarm is really easy. Right? You just install Docker. It's 2 lines. Install Docker, and then join the Swarm, and then maybe install Portainer to manage your Swarm. It's nice and easy. What does Discord offer versus Slack? Discord is better. Nice decision. So it's just simply a choice. So the thing about Slack, and I'll talk when we do a big announcement on Discord, I'll walk everybody through it. But Discord is meant for communities that are open, right? That you have people that you don't trust in it. And so you can do moderation. You can give people permissions and roles like you can with IRC. It's much more like the modern IRC, where Slack is assumed that you're in a trusted organization. So everything about Slack is assumed trust, which is problematic. If you run an open community on Slack, you end up having to create bots, and you have to sort of work around a lot of the limitations. There's not even a way in Slack to get an invite without using a third-party tool. So you can't have an open community on Slack without using something like Slacken as a front end to allow people to join. So Slack is not meant for open communities, and Slack has so many limits on the free edition. Discord has none of that. Discord is designed for open communities. It doesn't require you to pay for it to get a lot of the benefits. Their model for payment is fantastic because people can actually support the server. It's called servers. So I'm going to have my own server, and you can support the server by buying server Nitro or server coins, or I can't remember what it's called. What is it called? Server Boost. So you can buy Boost for a server to give it extra features. And so you can support the server that way. And each person doesn't have to be paid for. In Slack, if I wanted to run a paid Slack, I'd have to pay for every single person in that Slack, which is crazy. We have 31,000 people in Docker Mastery Slack. How could I ever do that? So the reason that I didn't do Discord 2 years ago was Discord was, they were gamer exclusive, gamer focused. And, all of us in DevOps, this is mostly a business thing. I mean, some of us are doing it for hobbies, but most of us do this for work. So I didn't want to use a gaming utility that was not designed for open communities, or it was focused exclusively on gamers. And they even had a terms of service back in the day that said you could not use it for business. So it was really weird with Discord to use it for business because it was technically against their terms of service. Well, a lot of that's changing in 2020. They're opening it up. Also, Discord has tons of bots. So does Slack. But because Discord is running huge open communities with 10,000 people online in the same server at the same time, it's much more like IRC in that way. And I'm an old IRC fan. Like, I still check on IRC every once in a while. And the problem with IRC is the protocols never evolved. So we never really got the evolution of IRC that we needed. It stayed the old standard protocol. And regardless of the fancy clients with IRC, you just couldn't really bring it easily into the modern world without a whole bunch of paid solutions. So I love that Discord is going to allow everyone to join for free, have advanced features, and I just love their model. And they're a great team. They make great software. They use Golang and Rust to make the apps, so the apps are super fast, very efficient. I think Discord, in my mind, is much more efficient than Slack rather. Anyway, there's lots of reasons, but go check it out, and you'll find that inside the app you can actually search for other communities and join them. Inside the app, it's designed for you to find those communities. So, yeah, no threads, sadly, no threads in Discord. It's on the wish list. But I'm not sure that it needs it. With the way that the channels are there, I mean, we didn't have threads in IRC, and IRC had decades of being the king, and arguably to some, IRC is still king, right? And it doesn't have threads. So I think that the way that they've designed it, with the way that the channels flow and whatnot, and how the ease of which you can mute and unmute things, I think it's really just about channels. Like, create a ton of channels. So the discoverability, by the way, I think is a lot better in Discord as well, in terms of finding channels, finding servers. It's a lot better. All right, enough about Discord. If my application is working fine on AWS EC2 instances or any VMs, why move it to a container? I'd say that if you already have a decent workflow, so there's lots of reasons to use containers. Containers aren't going to change the efficiency um, in terms of resource utilization, or it might actually increase it a little bit because Docker itself is going to take up some resources. But what I, as an operator, someone who has to take other people's code and constantly update servers with it, what I really and mostly appreciate about containers is two things. One is it's easier to update because the deployment workflow of this unit of work, it's a container image, and I can push it with a single command to a new server or a bunch of servers, and I can update those, and I don't have to worry about writing bash scripts to make sure that the Python version on the server is matching the developer. Like, that's all done in CI and during developer testing, right? That's all done in the Docker file. So by the time it gets to me, the server operator, I don't need to go check my server to make sure it's got the right dependencies, or worry that this new server I just built is slightly different than the old server that I had for a year, right? Those problems basically go away with containers. So I like the ability to just tear down a server, spin up a new one, and quickly, with a one-liner, deploy my app in exactly the same way I was running on my local machine with the exact same dependencies. It's quite hard, even if you're doing something like Ansible or Puppet or Chef or something, it's quite hard on a server to do that, even for just one app, before we had containers. Containers, the key was shipping all the dependencies in a reproducible format that is SHA-hashed to guarantee it's identical in every way on every bit of the binaries, based on the testing infrastructure and on the dev's own experience on their machine. So the works on my machine is the other real value. It's speed of deployment and constant updating of deployment solutions and the ease of which that's done. And then also the works on my machine problem kind of goes away. You can reproduce the same software across servers regardless of the server, installation or how it was built. That a lot of that goes away. So, does Docker for Windows have support for Windows Server and is prod ready? Yes, Moz. Since Windows Server 2016, Windows Server has supported Windows containers. Yes. I am not a developer. How should I plan or start learning microservices? You don't need to learn necessarily microservices. You just need to learn distributed computing. If you're not a developer, look up books on distributed computing. And there's one out there that I've read. It's by O'Reilly. So designing distributed systems. Come on. My browser's acting up. There we go. Designing distributed systems. I have read this book. I recommend it. If you're basically, microservices is all about breaking the parts of your application up into smaller units of work for developers, but from someone who's not writing the code and just needs to manage the code, then they don't need to worry about how microservices necessarily function internally. They just need to be able to design the systems to run it. And that's the same, more or less, in containers as it was when you had, your website on this server and your API over there on that server, and then your database on the backend server, right? So that's distributed computing. Just microservices takes that to the next level, and it breaks it into lots of little parts. So then you end up with way more different IP addresses that are constantly changing. So what you really need to learn about is distributed computing concepts first. That's the key first step there. All right. So I would recommend that book first. Hope that helps. Let's see. Oops. Oh, hey, what's up, Erwin? Michael Irwin, another Docker captain in chat. Let's see. Like my chat's still having problems today. It's like, I don't know what YouTube's doing. I get to interview a few folks on infrastructure, mostly Docker and K8s tomorrow. Give me some interesting scenarios. Okay, so you're going to have interviews for people, mostly Docker and K8s. All right, so here's a good one. That's a great question. If I was the interviewer, I wouldn't actually, I'm not sure that I would ask them, like, you're going to think up good Docker and K8s questions, right? So, you could ask, like, what are the two main features of the Linux kernel that Docker utilizes for creating and running containers, right? And in a sentence or two, describe what those things are, right? So that'll give you, if the answers are namespaces and C groups, and if they describe namespaces as, basically the namespaces are a way to corral a bunch of stuff in a kernel, like resources, and isolate them. And then C groups is about limiting resource utilization. So you can limit the RAM and you can limit the CPU usage for a particular binary application, okay? So there's lots of the stuff that goes into Docker, but those are really the two main. It's just interesting to see them speculate, even if they don't know. And a lot of people don't, and they can be still good Kubernetes Docker people. They might know the tools. But if you just kind of want to get a sense for how deep their knowledge goes, just ask them, what are the name some Linux kernel features that Docker uses. Or if it's a Windows shop, you could always ask them Windows kernel features, but that's probably even a harder question. But I wouldn't, I want to go back a little bit, and I don't necessarily want to talk about the tool itself. I want to understand, because I can always teach someone Kubernetes pretty quickly, right? Like if they understand the core concept of containers, they can probably learn Kubernetes quickly. What I'm more concerned about when I'm hiring engineers is two things. One is their core understanding of computing concepts that are not specific to any one tool. And two, how they learn. So one question I always ask, I think I've probably asked in every interview, is describe your home lab setup. And that question, I make the assumption that they have a home lab. So I'm going to say, describe your home lab setup. Now, if their answer turns into, well, I really just take courses on the internet and watch YouTube videos and, run them on my machine. And they go into it in a little bit deep. I might follow up with, okay, well, what are you learning right now? What have you learned this year? Like, describe to me some of the things you've done this year while you're learning. I might follow up with those questions. But really, the answer to that question is going to give me a detail for how passionate they are about technology and how much they want to learn new things. Because in this space, in DevOps, if you're wanting to be in containers, this is still relatively leading edge stuff, maybe even considered bleeding edge by some people. These concepts have Docker only existed for 7 years, right? So, a lot of people aren't savvy on this stuff. New people are taking my course every single day because they're just now getting into containers. So I want to learn how they learn, because I don't necessarily want to hire someone who hasn't applied learning practices on their weekly, monthly schedule. If they're not going through stuff on a weekly and monthly basis to learn new things, I don't want them on my team, because I don't want to have to hold their hand through learning all the new stuff, right? Because you can always learn another tool. You can always learn Terraform if you don't know it. But if you are in the habit of learning and how you learn. So if they tell me their home lab and they're like, oh yeah, I got this old switch from my last job and it's like really old, but I love playing with it. It helped me learn Cisco. And then I found an old Raspberry Pi, so I've got that hooked up. A friend gave me a Raspberry Pi and I played with that. And then I've got 3 Linux VMs. And I'm trying to learn the difference between Ubuntu and CentOS. Like if they start going off on that stuff, like I don't even care to hear about the rest. Like my ears won't even listen, because I know that they're passionate and they're always going to learn, right? So that curiosity is going to drive them, not just to learn the latest thing, because that's not always important, right? But they're going to learn, they're going to be passionate about figuring out new ways to do things, better ways to do things. And when you're on the DevOps path, that's really the approach you're going to take. There is no one done with DevOps. DevOps is a continual learning, continual optimization of the business pipeline of making and shipping software. So that there is no end to that goal. It is a marathon that takes forever. So that's what I care about. Now, here's my favorite question that I always ask, and I've been asking for 20 years. This is actually an old boss of mine that taught me this 20 years ago. I will ask someone, what on the OSI layer spectrum, we're talking about not the TCP layers, but the OSI layer, describe to me on networking the difference between a layer 3 device and a layer 4 device. Now, the opposite of that is I may ask, what's the difference between a network switch and a network hub? And describe to me the OSI layers that they're on. Or I will say, describe to me the difference between a switch and a router when it relates to TCP/IP and which layers of OSI you think those things are on, right? Because that's going to tell me a lot about their networking knowledge and their systems knowledge. And those things will pay off dividends for your entire career. If you're someone who's implementing DevOps in your company, but you don't understand what a TCP header might look like, or you've never looked at a router command line and had to implement routes manually to understand how IP packets move, or that you don't know what the standard default size of a TCP packet is, then what I hear from you is that you've learned really cool tools, but the minute there's a problem with any of that stuff, you're not going to know how the underlying stuff works. You're not going to understand how networking works. And in a world of distributed computing, everything is networking. Like, you maybe don't need to know the difference between the different Linux file formats, right? In terms of should I be using XFS or some newfangled some old style of file format on the hard drive. Like, you could probably get away with that, not having to know a lot of that stuff for a long period of time. You may never have to manually edit the some of the files in the etc directory of Linux. So I'm not looking so much for senior Linux engineering here. What I'm looking for is core concepts of networking competency. Because if you can understand basic networking, and you're going to be way more valuable in a troubleshooting scenario, and figuring out like Kubernetes, Docker, the cloud. All these things require core networking understanding. And then in order to even understand a firewall, you have to understand how TCP packets work, how connections are established, how IP subnets work. Like, that's all basic stuff there. So I tend to go to networking questions, because DevOps is about a lot of things, but it's always, no matter what your job is, it's always going to involve networking. Even if it's on one machine, two containers talking over one machine is usually through networking. So it's pretty important. Go read a TCP/IP book. That's my tip. All right. So that was a really long answer to your question, but I love the interview stuff, because we're all in interviews, and we're all at some point in our career going to have to be on an interview panel. And I'm not looking for trickery. I don't like to go for things that are like impossible scenarios, or to trick people into fooling them with some scenario to try to trick them. I'm not about that. Like, and I'm also not about the impossible questions. I just really want to understand where someone's expertise lies and get into the depths of that expertise, so that I can decide if that's the expertise I want. And I'm not trying to do that through trickery, which is why I ask about training, and I ask about networking. So, best place for documentation about Docker and Docker Swarm on Windows Server 2019. I would say the Docker docs first, and then just Google. I don't think there is any one website that's like killing it. If you start searching Google for Windows Server and Windows containers, like put Windows containers in quotes, right, on Google. Put Windows containers in quotes, and then you're only going to be getting documentation about Windows containers, hopefully, and not necessarily about Linux containers that happen to run on a Windows 10 machine or something. So I would do that. Does Docker support Kafka? I don't see why not. I've never run it, so I don't have to worry about it. But yeah, sure. I don't see why it wouldn't run in containers. Containers are just processes that are isolated. So you can run anything in a container that can run on Linux. Let's see. Oh, the chat's not being my friend today. We're looking for a top of the line container CVE scanner, like Twistlock, but it's very expensive. Yeah. Let me know what you pick, biker. Does native Windows containers still evolve, or does WSL2 stuff eventually replace it? So WSL2 doesn't have anything to do with containers. So Anton, I'm not really sure what you're talking about. WSL2 is creating a Linux machine on your Windows machine. I'm not. Oh, maybe you're just asking like, will Windows containers replace Linux containers for Windows people? I say they're going to always going to be in parallel. Windows containers are getting better all the time. They're a little bit behind the the Linux container evolution, but there's plenty of people that want to run .NET Foundation, right? And that stuff's only going to be until you get to .NET Core. You're always going to have to be on Windows. So I'm working on multiple projects that are Windows container specific, and that's because they just don't want to have to run a Linux VM. They'd rather just run it on the Windows server. So yeah, Windows containers are running in production today for plenty of people. Yeah, Microsoft Teams is popular in Microsoft shops for sure, but obviously it's not a great experience for communities on Teams though. Teams is very much Slack organization, businessy. You have to create external accounts and all that stuff when I have people coming in from the outside. So I don't really like it. One of the things I love about Discord is that you can check out a Discord without ever actually signing up. Like you can just kind of see it read only, and you don't have to sign up necessarily or join that server to just read only for a minute. You can kind of peek in. That's a really cool thing I think with Discord too, which is kind of like IRC, right? Like I don't necessarily want to announce myself in IRC just to be able to see something in IRC chat. So, did you work with VMware vRealize automation with DevOps? I did not. Test. GitLab runner Docker in Docker or GitLab runner shell mode. I don't know. Me1 RAM. I'd say both are valid. Docker in Docker has multiple connotations, but GitLab, I mean, it kind of depends on the architecture. Like, if you're in the cloud and you want to have dedicated servers, so then it might be easier to start out with the GitLab runners and then eventually move to Docker and Docker. I think it really depends on your workflow and how you want to get logs out and stuff like that. Also, a lot of times the decision is made for you based on whether or not you're going to want to have permissions on root of the host, right? So if you are not allowed to do anything on the root of the host, then you probably need to do Docker and Docker so that your GitLab is running Docker containers inside a Docker. It doesn't need to have root permissions on the host necessarily to do that. For your applications inside those Docker containers. So I think it's one half dozen or the other. I don't have a strong opinion. I've seen it done lots of ways. I've seen it done where you're running Docker in Docker, but you're actually you're talking to the host Docker. I've seen it run Docker in Docker. That's literally a nested virtualization inside of Docker. You can run now Docker in CI without root privileges. So you might want to check out root Docker rootless. So go get.docker.com/ I think it's rootless. Yeah. So that's the installer for rootless, or just search on Docker rootless mode. So I see people considering that for running in their like GitLab or any kind of CI where they don't necessarily want to have any root involvement, and they're not allowed to run Docker as root. So that might be useful. It's a little limiting on the networking side, though. You can't create a bunch of virtual networks in Docker without root, and that's a Linux limitation. That's not really Docker. So, what is your opinion on the container orchestration war, Docker Compose versus K8s? There is no container war. There's no container orchestration war. That is the internet giving you drama. There is simply choice. So, Docker Compose, I would not recommend for servers. Docker Compose is designed for local development use. It is not designed for servers in production. You can't do rolling updates with Compose. You can't do health check response. Docker Compose will not fix your container if it fails health check. It doesn't have any of those operational concerns. It won't store encrypted secrets. There's so many things it doesn't do. So to me, it's simply, if you have small requirements that are very basic and you don't mind running your own server, do a swarm, do a Docker swarm. If it's a very simple, just personal, it's a personal app, okay, on a server, maybe use Docker Compose, but I find Swarm to be just as easy as Docker Compose, and it has all those things like, fixing broken containers, doing rolling updates. storing secrets in encrypted databases, stuff like that. If you are in a business and you're talking about business productivity and business money, then the first thing I might consider is someone else's Kubernetes. So I would use AWS's Kubernetes, like Fargate with EKS. Fargate means I don't have to run servers. I don't have to care about servers. I can just get the job done and stop worrying about tinkering or messing up, quite frankly, all of the control plane stuff in Kubernetes. Because quite frankly, once I've learned Kubernetes, if I don't have to run the etcd database and worry about making sure that the backups and the restores and the failover of the etcd database is always going to work, like I don't have to worry about major upgrades breaking Kubernetes as much. If I could just remove that concern and then just focus on my Kubernetes manifest and my apps, that's what I want. And that means using someone else's Kubernetes. Every cloud now does it, it seems like. So I would recommend that. But if you've only got 5 containers or something and you're running on 1 or 3 or 5 servers or something like that, then try Swarm first. Try Swarm, see if it works. It works. It has really good, easy use cases, especially for non-persistent workflows where you don't need persistent data storage. So yeah. I mean, Kubernetes obviously is the most popular, but that's because it's taking over the world, but it's very enterprisey. So I don't underestimate the complexity of what Kubernetes can do. It can be very complex very quickly. So I am conscious of that, and I recommend simpler tools for simpler problems. Why the host flag does not work on Docker for Mac? I'm not sure. CJCS777. The host flag does not work on Docker for Mac. So I've never needed it. So what I'm wondering is, why do you need it? Why do you need it? What is it? What do you not get with Docker for Mac that you need that host flag to do? When you use publish, it puts it on the host port. So I'm not sure what you're needing there. If you're trying to run something on your Mac so that you can use it remotely, well, that's not what Docker Desktop's for. Docker Desktop is not for running containers to be accessed by remote people. It's for local use on that machine by a local developer or tester. So you might be using it in a way that it wasn't intended to be used. But hey, give me more information and I will figure it out. Let me know what you mean. The TCP/IP book is about 500 pages. Oh, Moz, it should be bigger than that. Like TCP/IP is, yeah. And you don't have to learn TCP/IP's version 6. Like you can opt out of that for a long, long time. Just focus on IPv4. I know there's heretic. I'm heretic. The future is IPv6. I get it, but you can get really far and do lots of things on IPv4. Let's talk about NetShoot container. Yes, NetShoot. You should try it. It's great. NetShoot. I recommend it all the time. So if you need networking utilities for Docker or Kubernetes, go try that. NetShoot. I'll put a link in the chat. It is a very useful. Basically, it's just a bunch of network utilities that are Linux utilities, all bundled into a single container image. There's nothing really special about it. It's just a handy Docker run command or Kubernetes run command, kube control run. It's just a special, easy way to run those tools. But it's an organized list of good utilities. Try Anchor for CVE or Claire. That's what Sparish. Sorry for mispronouncing that name. Reporting on Anchor is a lot better. Or just Anchor. How to manage Kubernetes cluster on a production application level. So I would say use AWS Fargate and worry about your app and not about the cluster. Because now you don't have to worry about managing servers or patching them or upgrading the Kubernetes version across different nodes without downtime. Like that's all hard stuff. So then you just get into application metrics. So if you're on AWS, you use Container Insights inside of CloudWatch. If you want to try Datadog, that's a really high-end, expensive but fancy solution for monitoring metrics. And you need to get in more into just the metrics of your application and having your application have its own metric endpoint so it can spit out, transactions per second, memory usage, stuff like that. And then you have the systems monitoring on top of that that's monitoring memory, the number of containers, resource utilization on the host itself. So I wouldn't get so much into the Kubernetes monitoring. If you're focusing on applications, just focus on application monitoring and leave the Kubernetes clusters and the Kubernetes monitoring up to the cloud. Let them do that. Any good tools for Kubernetes development? I don't recommend using Kubernetes to develop your app. If you're talking about developing on Kubernetes, like on the Kubernetes open source itself, I've never done it, so I don't have a tip for you. If you want to run Kubernetes locally for like maybe testing some CI stuff, look for Kind, Kubernetes in Docker, KIND. That's a good thing. Kubernetes, that's a popular tool for CI and for running Kubernetes inside of Docker without a whole lot of fuss. But I generally don't think that developers need to run Kubernetes to develop their app in. Kubernetes is an orchestration tool. It's not a development tool. It was never meant to be a development tool. I know that there are people and projects that are making it possible to run Kubernetes on your machine, to run your apps in. But in my opinion, Docker Compose is way easier. And if your app, most apps are not talking to the Kubernetes API. So if it's a Kubernetes native application that's talking to the Kubernetes API, okay, then yes, you probably need to have a local Kubernetes installation to do that. But most people are not doing that. And I have not met a single development team yet that really that loves to set up a CPU and battery burning Kubernetes cluster single machine on their local dev desktop just so that they can spin up an app for development. Like that's a lot of pain and suffering just to be able to develop. So I don't recommend it. A lot of people in cloud native don't do it. They see Kubernetes as a production orchestration tool. And yes, you need to test on it properly in your CI just to make sure that your manifests are correct, your health checks are correct. But I don't necessarily think you need to develop on it unless you're specifically trying to talk to a kube API. And then in theory, you could just talk to that kube API that's running somewhere else, right? It doesn't have to be run locally. Have any suggestions to improve Docker performance on Mac for big projects? I only have good performance experience. Okay. Do you have any suggestions to improve Docker performance on Mac for big projects? I only had good performance experience with Mutagen. So you're on Mac. So get on the Edge release. The Edge release on Mac is focusing heavily on performance right now. So if you're willing, you can always jump back to stable, but jump on the Edge. There is a new feature that uses a brand new back end on the file system called Fuse, gRPC Fuse. So, for instance, it's not showing me. That sucks. Yeah, it's not going to show you. But there's maybe I could do this. Let's see if I could do this. Try that. No. Oh, no, let's go to my clipboard. 1 second. There we go. So if you see this screenshot, there we go. There's a new backend in Mac using gRPC Fuse. It's supposed to be a lot better performance. There's also, Docker has been experimenting with built-in mutagen support, but they've kind of pulled that for now because mutagen has a lot of rough edges around Docker for Mac. So if you get into Edge, try that out. If you're on Windows WSL 2 is the fastest way to use Docker right now. But if you're on Mac, use this is an Edge feature. So yeah, try that. Hopefully that helps. Any insights on how to connect to AWS ECS Fargate container backend apps into RDS? How do I pass secrets into containers and env variables from Secrets Manager? Any good links or video? So Secrets Manager, I don't have any. So yeah, Robert, I don't. It should work, but I don't have any quick references on that. I know. Well, ECS Fargate. I don't normally use ECS, so I use EKS. I stopped using ECS many years ago. Basically, when Swarm came out, I stopped using ECS. But I know people that do it, so I'm sure that it supports the Secrets Manager. But I don't. Yeah, I don't have any quick. Sorry, I don't have any quick references for you on that. Jenkins and Jenkins X. Jenkins X is a completely different product. They're not related. They just have the same name. And Jenkins X is specifically for Kubernetes and is specifically focused on similar to GitOps workflow. The idea is that if you just need to do basic testing and then ship things into production on a Kubernetes cluster, and you don't have a previous need for Jenkins, then you should probably look at the Jenkins X project or something like Flux or Argo. If you Jenkins traditionally, the full product can work on any system. It's not Kubernetes specific, and it's got decades of support. It runs on Java, and it's can be quite fancy and complicated. But Jenkins X is a fresh project, starting from scratch, only for Kubernetes. OCI is something you should just Google. You should look up OCI and learn about the layers of technology that operate in computers and how those break out, and then learn TCP/IP and learn networking, because that will be one of the best things you can do for your career long term. Like understanding networking and routing and switching and what hubs and switches are and what a TCP packet is and how TCP is different from UDP, different from ICMP. Those are all very important concepts that you should know as anyone who's going to do anything with distributed computing. Honestly, I think it should be an introduction course for anyone who's going to be a developer as well, because developers, the more they understand basic networking, the better they can make their apps run on distributed computing. Which Docker container registry do you prefer, Harbor or Nexus or something else, and why? I don't have a strong opinion. I don't. I use Docker Hub, so I use SaaS. I don't use self-hosted. And most teams I work with don't have justification to run their own, so they use a SaaS, right? They might use Quay, they might use Docker Hub, they might have maybe bought one in the past, but I am interested in the GitOps. I'm sorry, the GitHub new container registry, but I still don't think it's going to be better than Docker Hub. So I would just might as well use Docker Hub. And since Docker is betting the farm on Docker Hub, I'm bullish on Docker Hub as becoming a better tool over the next year and having all the features that we really want it to have, like scanning and advanced functionality that we hope for. So I would say probably Docker Hub at this point. If you're picking something new, if you need something that's advanced, like there's a lot of registries that do advanced things like, BitTorrent replication, built-in on-prem scanning and stuff like that, then yeah, sure, just look at the ones that have those requirements. They all are fine. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. And I don't have a lot of experience, to be honest. I don't have a lot of experience running those because I don't recommend it to customers. They don't have those needs yet. They might just need a proxy at this point. So we'll implement a free proxy, one of the proxy options out there, like the Docker registry. Argo CD is great. Argo CD and Flux are awesome. So whichever one floats your boat. Flux is very limited. It's one cluster per Git repo, although I think version 2 that's coming out soon will change that. Argo is a much larger tool that allows you to do full CD across many clusters, multiple repos, all these different things. So it's a bigger scope. But yeah, if I had to implement today, I'd probably be looking at Argo as one of my top contenders for CI and CD and GitOps workflows. Is there a way to configure a delay between starting services in Docker Compose, for example, to wait until Docker Compose is popular with data? Yes. Yes, Anton, absolutely. And people don't know about it. So I will show you. In fact, it's in my little repo here that we just showed off all ago. This repo shows you how to do it. It's not the purpose of this repo, but what you need is 2 parts. Well, 3 parts technically. You need to be using version 2 of the compose file, not version 3. And then you add depends on with a condition of healthy, which means that it'll wait for that service to start and be marked healthy by the health check, which you add. So for example, I add a health check here to traffic, and then on the other services that depend on it, I tell them to wait for traffic to start up and be healthy. So if you didn't realize it, this is the magic part that glues it all together. This is only something you can get in the 2.4 branch of the file. So this doesn't work in Swarm. This is meant specifically for Docker Compose local use, which I always use 2. something. Although in a future update, we're going to talk about Docker Compose because they just shipped a major update that is merging the Compose files. So we haven't talked about that. I'll probably talk about that next week. Docker Compose releases. I just saw it shipped this week. So 127. Pin a new internal schema version to 3.9 as a default. Preserve the version when configured with the Compose file. And then this right here, version 1.27. Merge 2 and 3 Compose formats and align with Compose spec schema. So I haven't learned all about this yet, but this is a big deal because one of the goals of the team has been all year long is to basically get rid of the versioning in Compose files. Just let it be a feature set thing and not so much what does my version of Compose file support. So it requires more development on their end and more work on their end to make sure things are compatible. But we're moving towards a future where we're going to be able to stop worrying about Compose file versions and we'll just be able to start using features. So anyway, I will send you this Compose YAML and hopefully you can figure that out. I talk about it a lot on this show. So if you go back on Bret.live, if you go up there and go back in this show and search for Compose, you maybe will see me doing some demos on how Compose will have a delayed startup for you. All right. Do you have any suggestions on how to use dynamic variables in K8's YAML? It's working well with Docker Swarm service, but not with K8's. Dynamic variables in Kubernetes YAML. So I'm not sure what you mean, Casimir. Sorry if I mispronounced that. By dynamic variables, if you're talking about templating, so that would be something where you would use customize, right, with YAML templating, so that maybe an environment variable or another YAML file is pulled into your Kubernetes YAML when you deploy it. So you could either look at Customize or at Helm for that kind of work. I'm guessing that's what you're talking about with dynamic variables. Let me know if that's not the answer you're looking for. All right. Swarm services, Swarm Compose and Service YAML has that YAML templating built in. With Kubernetes, you need to use something like Customize or Helm or many of the other, I think almost 100 different deployment options for how to manage your YAML. At this point, there's far too many. Would you recommend using Scaffold or Kind? I don't use Scaffold. I don't recommend Scaffold. There's nothing wrong with Scaffold. I just don't think people need to have Kubernetes running for development. I don't. If your application is using the Kubernetes API, that's one thing. And then I would say, yeah, use Kind. But if you need Kubernetes for development, then I would say your application is too. I would say you're probably designing your application. I think as Kelsey Hightower puts it, you're designing a distributed monolith. Because ideally, all the different parts of your application should be should be infrastructure agnostic. It should be able to run on any infrastructure, not just Kubernetes, unless there's specific things your application is talking to the Kubernetes API for, which is, I think, the word we're looking at is Kubernetes native applications. I'm kind of okay with that in some ways, in some respects, but I'm also leery of that in some other respects because building applications that are dependent upon Kubernetes may not bode well in the future. I would much rather depend on some sort of standard config store rather than a Kubernetes as the config store for that kind of thing. I don't know. It just depends on your application, really. But I have not yet seen someone with a valid reason for using Scaffold. But then again, I'm not working at Google, so I don't see a lot of those people that are doing that kind of thing. So for Fargate RDS, there should be a way to use task role. Oh, you're thanks. No. I think you're giving an answer to the previous question on Fargate RDS. Oh, OCI container Open Container Initiative. I don't have. I'm not sure what the original question was. It's a format, right? So it's a spec. I'm not really super savvy on what the differences are there. So yeah, so it's just a spec, right? No one ever really worries about it. No one ever even talks about it. So I was getting OCI confused with OSI. Sorry about that. So OSI layers. That's what I was talking about. Not OCI layers. There's no such thing as OCI layers, really. There's maybe an OCI container image layers, but that's not what I was talking about. I was totally confused. But yeah, OCI. It's just a thing. The difference would be is maybe if you're running an OCI compatible Docker image or doing a build with an OCI compatible spec, then you maybe don't get every single feature that Docker would apply. But everyone I know uses Docker to build things. So OCI was really just about extracting and standardizing on the runtime as well as the image spec. So it's for lower level people, right? Like people that are building container runtimes care about it, and building image builds care about it, but you and I don't have to care about it. So sorry for the confusion on that. Have you tried VMware's Nautilus container engine that is now part of VMware Fusion and the next version of VMware Workstation? And the next version it will work with Kind. No, I have not, because I am not a VMware Fusion person. I am more on Windows. I would just use Hyper-V, and on Mac I use Parallels. So I don't use VMware Fusion, and I probably won't try it. I mean, I know of it. It's interesting. I think for maybe someone who's doing container native, I'm not yet convinced that that's going to, I'm not really sure exactly how they're going to save us time, right? So is this going to mean that I don't need Docker Desktop installed? And now I'm running everything inside of VMware Fusion. And if that's so, then am I not using Docker Compose anymore? I'm not really sure what's going on there. So I saw the announcement, and I haven't played with a beta, so I'm not really the smartest person on that. I'm skeptical that it's going to be something that's going to replace my current workflow. I guess is what I'm saying. How often should we be upgrading versions on Docker servers? I would say I personally upgrade Docker on a monthly patch schedule, like I patch all my servers. I patch servers once a month. Either I implement an automated process or I manually update them. If you're managing a server, you have to do security patches anyway. So I just do security patches along with product updates. And so I tend to do a monthly update cycle on Docker. Docker lately has had a patch version just about every month anyway. So I would say monthly. Best practice for Docker Swarm scaling policy. I don't really have, it all depends on your app. And so when you think about scaling, you have to think about container scaling and node scaling. They're totally different, and they have totally different solutions. So horizontal scaling of containers It's not something that's built out of the box in Swarm, so you would have to go implement that with a third-party solution, maybe Prometheus, something like that. But I don't, I work with large companies that still don't auto-scale. Large meaning they have millions of customers and thousands of connections, and they don't necessarily auto-scale. The last thing they usually do is auto-scale containers plus nodes. So horizontal pod scaling plus node auto scaling. That's something they do after they're comfortable in production for a long period of time and they've really understood their application. And because if you scale up, you're going to have to scale down, and scaling down can be really hard if you're not focused on how to do that correctly and how to make sure you don't terminate connections. So that is a thing. So I would say focus on your app. Focus on making sure your app updates work well without losing any single connection, and that all your clients are gracefully had their connections retried on new containers. That's a process. If you look at my DockerCon talk from 2019, I talk about that. I think my DockerCon 2019 talk, I talked a little bit about connection retries and how that, and all the stuff. So I have people focus more on that. And then if they think they're going to need the scale, then they just create those containers out of the box. I mean, most apps, with containers, you can spin up many more replicas than you need that will scale. The connections automatically spread across, and usually most apps, when they're idle, don't use a lot of memory anyway. So I tend to over provision container replicas. And then if you need to scale up nodes, that's a little bit easier at first, sometimes I find, than scaling up containers. But it just really depends on the project. It depends on your applications. For example, auto-scaling databases, way different than auto-scaling apps. Like, there's way more complexity and difficulty in auto-scaling databases. And typically, auto-scaling databases is like not just hard, but like unnecessary in a lot of cases, because you probably should let someone else do that. Like use RDS, don't do it yourself. Can you suggest tools or services for creating YAML files for K8s for Docker files and validation? There's a Docker file linter on GitHub. So just search Docker file linter for Docker files. For Kubernetes manifest, you can use the kube control command line has functionality built in to do a lot of that with the YAML. And for generation, like I teach in my courses, I'm not a super big fan of generators. Typically, what you're going to end up with is your own templates that you use over and over again that have the same kind of health checks and the same labels and the same environment variables that you need. And you can't generate those from a generator. So if you have a bunch of compose files and you're looking to just have basics in Kubernetes, you might look at Compose. Is it Compose with a K? I think there's a tool out there that'll basically generate Kubernetes manifest from Compose YAML. But I'm not a big fan of a lot of this automation, because you need to understand manifest. If you're someone who's making manifests, then you need to understand how manifests are built. And so in my courses, I teach you the skills, like my Kubernetes mastery course, we go through the skill of learning how to use the API docs, the command line, specifically the kube control command line, and how to discover what resources you have, how to make those resources in YAML, and then how to add all the different functionality in the spec that you can use by discovering it through the command line, right? Most people, we just start with searching on Google, but I teach you the tools that you need to have in your toolbox for how to do this stuff with the API itself and the command line itself. So that's a little plug for my Kubernetes mastery course. You can just search for that. KubernetesMastery.com. And there's a link down below. If you're on YouTube, you can see the link down below. What are your thoughts on using Docker multi? Okay, so this could be the last two questions, and then I'm gonna bounce. What are your thoughts on using Docker multi-stage to have the top of build stage, another stage dedicated for local development environment, and for example, adding Git or OpenSSH to push? I don't certainly think you need SSH in your Docker files. I typically do not need Git in my Docker files. So I'm not sure about that, but Funky OZ channel. I will give you some repos here that do just exactly that. So I have, in fact, it's this DockerCon 19 talk that I just actually put into chat. So look in the chat link. That is, there's already an entire talk on me walking you through multi-stage Docker files and how to build them. So I'm all about multi-stage. Always do multi-stage. I'm a big fan of multi-stage. I think it's fantastic. It'll help make fancier images, smaller images, faster builds of images. Multi-stage is the way to go. And you are most welcome for all the questions and answers. I thank you for your questions, and you are most welcome for the answers. So I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to be here next week, and we're going to be, I think, talking a little bit about, I'm going to put on the list to talk about next week, Compose, the new features of the Compose release, so Docker Compose, and how that's going to be changing the versions. And maybe we'll have a guest. I don't know if I can see if I can get a guest on the show here pretty soon to talk about Compose. But same time, same place, next week, back here on YouTube and all the places like Twitch and Twitter, Patreon, or not Patreon, Periscope, if you happen to watch me on Twitter. But again, you can find all my course coupons and links to Patreon down below in the YouTube. And make sure you like and subscribe on this YouTube channel so you can see me when I go live every week. And I sometimes have guests, sometimes don't. And I will see you again next week. Thank you so much. Ciao.